twins with extreme deformities. What results from the marriage of siblings? The biological repercussions of consanguineous unions remain among humanity's most unsettling narratives, particularly when these occur over multiple generations. An Appalachian lineage. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically in the state of West Virginia, lay a community that time had forgotten. The year was 1937. The country was still struggling to recover from the Great Depression's effects. While signs of economic revival were appearing in major cities, the steep slopes and isolated valleys of the Appalachians remained a separate world, where families adhered to traditions dating back generations. The Blackwood family was one such lineage. Established in that area since the late 18th century, when the first European settlers ventured through the Appalachian Range, the Blackwoods were known for their self-imposed isolation. As decades passed, they remained while other families moved to cities seeking opportunities, effectively becoming a genetic island in the mountains. Isolation and inbreeding. Nearby town residents always viewed the Blackwood clan with suspicion, reports Dr. Thomas Harrison, a historian at the University of West Virginia who dedicated decades to studying isolated regional communities. They seldom descended the mountain, only to trade crafts and furs for necessary supplies. Marriages within the family became a normal occurrence, driven not by deliberate choice but by social and geographical inevitability. The Blackwood property functioned as a closed world. A winding, treacherous dirt road served as the only access point, making visits rare, especially during severe mountain winters. The main residence, a two-story wooden structure erected by the original patriarch, Isaiah Blackwood, had been expanded over the years to house the growing family. Smaller cabins housed the various branches, forming a small family settlement around the main house. Sarah and Joseph Blackwood were first cousins who married in 1915. Like many family members before them, this union seemed entirely acceptable. For them, it merely continued a family pattern. The birth of disaster. The couple's first children were born without obvious issues, although some displayed slight learning difficulties and less than average height. It was in 1929, as the Great Depression began, that Sarah gave birth to twins, Edward and Eleanor. From the start, it was clear that something was gravely wrong. The local doctor, who rarely visited the community, was urgently summoned. What he witnessed left him profoundly disturbed, as recorded in his medical diary discovered years later. Such deformities in newborns I have never witnessed. The children exhibit severe cranial malformations with disproportionately large heads. Their upper limbs are underdeveloped, and neither appears capable of normal sucking. I fear they will not survive beyond a few days. I strongly suspect the cause is the parents' consanguineous union, compounded by previous generations of marriages between close relatives. Against all medical expectation, Edward and Eleanor survived. In the following years, they showed profound developmental delays, failing to reach basic milestones such as crawling, sitting, or speaking. Their bodies remained underdeveloped and fragile, while their heads continued to grow abnormally. Genetic devastation. The condition afflicting the Blackwood twins was likely a severe form of hydrocephalus combined with other genetic anomalies resulting from prolonged consanguinity, explains Dr. Melissa Carter, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. The probability of harmful recessive genes manifesting drastically increases when close relatives have children. Where consanguineous marriages occur over multiple generations, these effects can become devastating. The birth of the twins served as a turning point for the Blackwood family. Unable to accept her children's condition, Sarah sank into deep depression. Joseph, in turn, retreated even further into isolation, prohibiting all outside contact with the family. The tragedy unfolds. It was within this setting of extreme isolation that an event transpired, one that would irrevocably alter the Blackwood family's destiny. The disturbing incident remained a whispered secret in neighboring communities for decades. By 1937, the twins, now 8 years old, needed constant care. Being unable to communicate or walk, they were totally reliant on their relatives. This situation led to mounting tension within the family, particularly between Joseph and Sarah. Their discussions became increasingly intense and frequent. On a notably cold January night, as a snowstorm further sealed off the property, an argument between the couple escalated to unprecedented levels. Screams echoed through the main house, waking other family members. "This isn't natural. Look what we've done. Look at them," Sarah was heard yelling, according to subsequent reports from one of the couple's nephews. The next morning, after the storm finally subsided, the family awoke to a scene of horror. The twins had vanished, along with Sarah. Only tracks in the fresh snow led towards a nearby cliff's edge. What took place that night remains one of the darkest chapters in the Blackwood family history and a tragic testament to the destructive consequences produced by decades of consanguineous marriages. An unquestionable dogma. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. The truth regarding isolated family lineages in rural America is being revealed here, complete with scientific and historical details unavailable elsewhere. Your subscription is vital for us to keep investigating these cases that history attempted to suppress. To fully comprehend what led to that fateful winter night in 1937, the Blackwood family's story demands we look even further back in time and examine how this pattern of consanguinity and isolation was established. Patriarch Isaiah Blackwood arrived in the Appalachian Mountains in 1792, having fled New England following accusations of heterodox practices. A suspicious and taciturn man, Isaiah believed that the outside world was corrupt, and that only through isolation could his family preserve what he called spiritual and physical purity. Isaiah Blackwood is a classic case of a leader who employed isolation as a tool of control, explains Dr. Rebecca Johnson, an anthropologist specializing in closed communities. Historical archives suggest he had been expelled from 3 different communities before finding refuge in the mountains, always for imposing extreme segregationist views on the family. In his personal notes, discovered in a hidden chest within the main house only in the 1970s, Isaiah wrote, "Our lineages must remain pure, without mixing with outsiders. The strength of our blood depends on it." This warped perspective was passed down as an unquestionable dogma to subsequent generations. By the 3rd generation, the Blackwoods rarely married outside the family. Marriage between cousins became the norm, and sometimes even closer unions occurred. Problems started to surface gradually. Cumulative genetic risk. In the 1850s, local documents noted that Blackwood children showed alarming peculiarities, including cognitive difficulties, vision problems, and smaller statures. However, the family attributed these issues to divine trials or curses, never questioning their matrimonial practices. What we're observing here is a classic example of how isolation can lead to genetically dangerous practices, asserts Dr. Howard Miller, a geneticist at Princeton University. The effects of consanguinity are cumulative. While a single generation of a cousin marriage may have minimal effects, the risk of serious genetic anomalies increases exponentially when this practice is repeated over 5, 6, or 7 generations. With Joseph and Sarah Blackwood being first cousins and direct descendants of 6 generations of consanguineous marriages, the stage was perfectly set for a genetic catastrophe. When Sarah became pregnant for the 3rd time in 1928, she had already given birth to 2 children showing mild effects of consanguinity, Michael, who had 6 fingers on each hand, and Ruth, who had learning difficulties. The mirrored twins. The twins' pregnancy proved exceptionally hard. Sarah suffered from severe nausea throughout the gestational period and gained very little weight. The delivery, which occurred during a snowstorm that prevented the doctor from arriving, was assisted only by the family's older women. Edward was born 20 minutes after Eleanor. The shock was immediate. Beyond heads that were disproportionately large, the babies displayed multiple deformities. Their eyes were widely spaced, their hands had fused fingers, and their lips had fissures. Even more disturbing, the twins seemed to mirror each other. Edward had more pronounced deformities on the body's left side, while Eleanor presented them on the right side. This is a phenomenon known as genetic complementarity, which is particularly concerning in twins born from consanguineous unions, explains Dr. Carter. It is as if the compromised genetic material was distributed between the 2 fetuses, leading to mirrored patterns of malformations. This is extremely rare but well documented in medical literature, especially among genetically isolated populations. A burden of care. As the twins grew, their conditions became more challenging. They still couldn't sit without support at 3 years old. By age 5, they hadn't developed comprehensible speech, although they seemed to understand simple commands. Most unsettling was the extraordinary bond between them. They became extremely agitated, emitting distressing screams until reunited when separated, even if only by a wall. While this type of connection is common in healthy monozygotic twins, it can manifest in even more intense ways in cases of compromised neurological development, observes Dr. William Tennant, a pediatric neurologist who studied the Blackwood twins' few medical records decades later. Reports suggest Edward and Eleanor likely shared a form of nonverbal communication that other family members couldn't understand. The twins' condition slowly worsened. Edward began having frequent seizures at age 7. Eleanor developed severe scoliosis, further limiting her already restricted mobility. The burden of their care fell primarily on Sarah, as Joseph spent increasing time away, hunting in the mountains or working in the family fields. The mounting pressure. A distant cousin, Daniel Blackwood, who visited occasionally to bring supplies, left a disturbing account in his personal diary, dated November 1936. "I visited Sarah and Joseph today. The situation deteriorates each time I come. The children are larger, more difficult to carry, yet equally dependent. Sarah looks like a ghost of herself. Her eyes are empty, sunken. When I suggested taking the twins to a specialist in Charleston, Joseph exploded in anger. 'No outsider will lay hands on my children,' he shouted. 'I fear for what might happen inside that house.' The closest neighbors, the Patterson family, who lived about 5 kilometers away, reported hearing screams from the Blackwood property with increasing frequency during the winter of 1936 to 1937. On one occasion, Martha Patterson found Sarah wandering alone in the forest, talking to herself incoherently. She was heard repeating something about ending the suffering and cleansing the blood. Martha later reported, "I tried to take her home, but she refused my help. I should have insisted more. Perhaps I could have prevented what followed." The final act. The fateful winter of 1937 was one of the most severe ever recorded in the Appalachian Mountains. The already reclusive Blackwood family became further isolated by successive snowstorms. It was within this context of extreme isolation, without external support and under unbearable psychological pressure, the disaster became inevitable. The morning after the twins and Sarah disappeared dawned cold and clear. The snow had stopped, leaving an immaculate white layer covering the Blackwood property. Thomas, Joseph's younger brother, was the first to notice the tracks in the snow leading from the main house towards the cliff known as Devil's Leap, a precipice with a free fall of over 80 meters to the rocky river below. "Something's wrong," Thomas said upon finding his brother in the kitchen. "Sarah and the children aren't in the house, and there are footprints going to the cliff." The discovery and the diary. A frantic search ensued. Joseph, Thomas, and 2 cousins followed the tracks in the snow. They were easy to follow and clearly visible, a set of adult footprints accompanied by drag marks, indicating Sarah had dragged or carried the incapacitated twins. The tracks ended abruptly at the cliff's edge. There was no sign of struggle, just an area where the snow had been compacted, as if someone had stood there for a period. "She stood here," Joseph murmured, kneeling in the snow. "She stood here looking down." The search for the bodies began immediately, but conditions were nearly impossible. The river was partly frozen, its banks covered with snow, and the steep terrain made descent extremely dangerous. It was 3 days later that they found the first body, little Edward, trapped between rocks about half a kilometer downstream. His body was remarkably preserved by the cold, his eyes staring at the grey winter sky. Eleanor's body was found the next day, further away, almost entirely covered by snow on the riverbanks. Sarah remained missing for another 2 weeks. When they finally found her, it was a shock to everyone. Her body was not on the riverbanks or in the river itself, but in a small cave on the face of the cliff, about 20 meters below the top. She had somehow survived the initial fall, dragging herself to the cave's shelter, where she finally succumbed, likely due to a combination of injuries and exposure to the extreme cold. Most disturbing was the discovery of a diary, protected in a waterproof bag, containing her last words. Although the pages were stained with tears and blood, the text was legible. "May God forgive me for what I've done. I could no longer bear to see my angel suffering. It got worse each day. Edward had 3 seizures yesterday. Eleanor won't stop crying. I know it's our fault. The blood is cursed. Generations of sin have brought us here. I tried my best to love my children, but against what we've done, love isn't enough. Now I understand what my grandmother tried to tell me before marrying Joseph. The blood needs new life, she said. But I didn't listen. No one listened. And now my babies pay the price. There is no hope for them in this world. I can only pray they find peace in the next. May God have mercy on our souls. The aftermath and Joseph's decline. Local authorities investigated the case, but in isolated communities like this in the late 1930s, such family tragedies rarely received more than a superficial investigation. The official verdict was accidental death, although everyone involved knew it was clearly a case of maternal despair culminating in an unimaginable tragedy. Joseph Blackwood never recovered from the loss. In the following months, he grew even more reclusive, often sleeping in the empty room that had belonged to the twins. Neighbors reported hearing him talking as if the children were still there. The Blackwood family's story represents one of the most extreme illustrations of the impact of prolonged consanguinity, states Dr. Miller. What makes this case particularly tragic is that, unlike some isolated communities practicing consanguineous marriages for religious or cultural reasons, the Blackwoods appear to have been victims of geographical isolation and their founders' paranoia, leading to generations of practices that resulted in devastating consequences. If you feel your heart tighten with this story, you are not alone. Leave "the blood needs new life" in the comments. This phrase from Sarah's grandmother holds a powerful scientific truth that many isolated communities discovered too late. Your comment helps keep this important discussion about consanguinity risks alive. Dr. Carlson's intervention. The case of the Blackwood twins might have remained merely a tragic local event had it not been for the arrival of someone who would permanently change the understanding of the situation in that isolated community. In September 1937, only 8 months after the tragedy, a young doctor named Dr. Robert Carlson arrived in the small town of Millerville, the closest to the Blackwood property. Recently graduated from Johns Hopkins University, Carlson had chosen to work in a rural area as part of a federal program created during the New Deal to deliver medical assistance to remote regions. Idealistic and curious, Dr. Carlson soon began hearing rumors about the Mountain family and their strange children. He initially attributed these stories to local superstition, but while treating a member of the Patterson family for pneumonia, he heard first-hand accounts about the Blackwoods and the recent tragedy involving the twins and Sarah. As a doctor, I cannot ignore what appears to be a clear case of severe genetic problems, he wrote in his professional diary. If what they say regarding generations of close relative marriages is true, this family represents a significant scientific case study, as well as a human tragedy that potentially could have been avoided with proper medical intervention. Dr. Carlson was unaware that his arrival in the region would initiate one of the most comprehensive studies on consanguinity ever undertaken in the United States. With persistence and patience, he began to establish a relationship with the more accessible Blackwood family members, primarily Thomas, Joseph's brother, who occasionally came to town for supplies. Earning trust and documenting anomalies. His efforts to earn the Blackwoods' trust were extraordinary, comments Dr. Elizabeth Winters, a medical historian at Columbia University. At a time when medical professionals and rural communities were vastly distant, Carlson demonstrated remarkable sensitivity, gradually approaching and offering help without judgment. Dr. Carlson's records, later published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 1952, with names altered for privacy protection, reveal the slow process of discovering the problem's extent. He initially gained permission only to examine some of the family's children, under the guise of providing a free checkup. What he found deeply alarmed him. Of the 17 children he first examined, 14 presented some type of physical or cognitive anomaly: fused fingers, syndactyly, underdeveloped jaws, micrognathia, severe strabismus, partial or total deafness, and varying degrees of intellectual impairment. Almost all were significantly below average height for their age. The pattern is consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding, he wrote in his notes. The observed problems are clearly the result of the expression of harmful recessive genes that would remain dormant in a genetically diverse population. The concentration of these genes through successive consanguineous marriages has created a high-risk situation for every new child born into the family. 7 generations of inbreeding. Over time, especially after gaining Thomas Blackwood's trust, Dr. Carlson accessed the complete family history with the aid of oral accounts, birth certificates, and parish records. He reconstructed the Blackwoods family tree, documenting 7 generations of consanguineous marriages, including several unions between first cousins and at least 2 cases of marriages between niece and uncle. What Carlson documented was essentially an involuntary experiment in human genetics, explains Dr. Miller. In isolated populations like the Blackwoods, where close relative marriages occur for generations, the frequency of recessive genetic diseases can drastically increase. These deleterious genes normally remain hidden because an individual must inherit 2 copies of the gene, one from each parent, to manifest the condition. When both parents share recent ancestors, the probability of carrying the same harmful recessive genes increases significantly. The case of the twins Edward and Eleanor represented the extreme culmination of this phenomenon. Based on available descriptions and the few medical records, modern specialists believe they likely suffered from a rare combination of congenital hydrocephalus, craniosynosis, premature closure of cranial sutures, and multiple other malformations resulting from the expression of deleterious recessive genes. Joseph's confession. The most tragic aspect of this story is that it was not a biological inevitability, but the direct result of social practices that could have been avoided, states Dr. Johnson. Self-imposed isolation aggravated geographical isolation, transforming a circumstantial tendency into a devastating family dogma. Joseph Blackwood, still reeling from the loss of his children and wife, initially refused to speak with Dr. Carlson. It wasn't until 1939, almost 2 years after the tragedy, that he finally agreed to talk. The account of this meeting, preserved in Carlson's notes, is moving. I met JB today at his home. The man appears to have aged 20 years in just 2, completely grey hair, distant gaze, hunched posture. The house is neglected. When I mentioned the reason for my visit, to discuss the risks of close relative marriages, he initially shut down. After some silence, he began to speak about the twins. They had eyes just like mine, he said, even though he couldn't speak properly. Edward laughed just like my father. Can you imagine that, doctor, seeing your own father in the eyes of a child who can barely lift his head? And Eleanor, she held my finger with such strength, so small, but with such strength. When I asked if he knew that marriage between cousins could cause problems for children, he replied, my parents were cousins. Their parents too. Everyone seemed normal. How could I have known? This is the fundamental tragedy, ignorance passing from generation to generation, combined with distrust of the outside world and isolation. When Carlson attempted to explain the basic principles of heredity, Joseph interrupted him, it's too late for me now, doctor, but maybe not for the others. Talk to my brother. Talk to the young ones. Education and genetic diversity. And that is precisely what Dr. Carlson did. In the following years, he worked tirelessly with the younger Blackwood family members, educating them about the risks of consanguinity and assisting in establishing connections with neighboring communities. His work was not limited to the Blackwoods. He identified several other isolated Appalachian families with similar, though less extreme, patterns of consanguineous marriages. The 1940s ushered in significant changes for the region. Subsequent industrialization and World War II drew many young people from the mountains to urban areas. The construction of better roads lessened geographical isolation. Electricity reached previously isolated areas. Perhaps most importantly, medical knowledge became more accessible to the Blackwoods. The shift was gradual but significant. Thomas, Joseph's brother, became a vocal advocate against marriages between relatives, openly sharing his family's tragic history as a warning. Several young Blackwoods married people from outside the family, introducing the necessary genetic diversity to the lineage. A powerful legacy. Joseph Blackwood never fully recovered. He lived as a recluse until his death in 1952 at age 64. In his final years, he allowed Dr. Carlson to document the complete family history on the condition that real names be altered in any publication. Joseph realized, too late for his own immediate family, that their story could save others. Carlson wrote, "Tell the truth, doctor. Tell it so that no one else goes through what we went through, he told me at our last meeting. The Blackwood family's legacy extends far beyond their personal tragedy. Dr. Carlson's study, published under the title Effects of Prolonged Consanguinity in Isolated Appalachian Populations, became a reference in medical literature on population genetics. Although names and locations were altered for privacy, the compiled data offered valuable insights into the mechanisms of heredity and the specific risks associated with recurrent consanguineous marriages. Carlson's work was pioneering, states Dr. James Wilson, professor of medical genetics at Harvard University. In an era before human genome mapping, when our understanding of genetics was still rudimentary, he successfully documented inheritance patterns and clearly demonstrated how certain conditions manifested with increased frequency in lineages with a high degree of consanguinity. Quantifying the danger. The data collected by Dr. Carlson showed that the incidence of congenital anomalies in the Blackwood family was approximately 17 times higher than in the general population. The most common conditions included anomaly incidence. Polydactyly, extra fingers, 23%. Syndactyly, fused fingers, 18%. Microcephaly, abnormally small head, 12%. Hydrocephalus, fluid accumulation in the brain, 7%. Intellectual disability, various degrees, almost equal to 45%. Congenital deafness, 19%. Cardiac malformations, 14%. Export to sheets. What makes Carlson's study so valuable is his ability to follow the family for over a decade, documenting how the introduction of new genes through marriages with unrelated people began to reduce the incidence of these conditions in subsequent generations, explains Dr. Carter. Indeed, in the generation born between 1940 and 1955, after Carlson's educational efforts began, the incidence of congenital anomalies dropped dramatically. Of the 28 children born during this period, only 6 presented any of the previously common conditions, and even these were milder. A case study in social change. The Blackwood story eventually transcended the purely medical realm, becoming a case study also for anthropologists, sociologists, and historians interested in the dynamics of isolated communities and the impact of cultural beliefs on marital practices. What happened to the Blackwoods resulted not simply from individual decisions, but from a complex interplay of geographical isolation, specific cultural beliefs, and lack of access to scientific information, observes Dr. Johnson. This raises the question of how many other isolated communities worldwide may be facing similar problems even today. Indeed, modern studies have identified several global populations where consanguineous marriages remain common, often due to geographical isolation or cultural traditions. Modern science allows us to precisely quantify and understand the specific risks, explains Dr. Wilson. We now know that a single marriage between first cousins increases the risk of congenital anomalies by approximately 4 to 7% above the population baseline. While significant, this risk is manageable with adequate genetic counseling. The true danger arises when these marriages occur repeatedly over multiple generations, as in the Blackwoods case. The fate of the Blackwood property mirrors the changes within the family. The main house, where Joseph spent his final secluded years, was abandoned after his death and eventually succumbed to the elements. The lands were divided among the descendants, many of whom opted to sell their portions and move to urban areas. In 1972, Thomas Blackwood Jr., Joseph's nephew and one of the first family members to obtain a university education, established the Blackwood Foundation for Genetic Studies. Using resources from the sale of part of the family lands, the foundation funds research on rare genetic diseases and provides free genetic counseling for families in isolated rural areas. It's our way of transforming the family tragedy into something positive, declared Thomas Jr. in a 1975 interview. If the knowledge that emerged from our family's suffering can prevent others from going through the same, then something good will have come from all this. Light from the shadows. The twins, Edward and Eleanor Blackwood, whose brief, difficult lives catalyzed such significant changes, were buried in a small family cemetery on the property. For decades, simple stones marked their graves. In 1997, on the 60th anniversary of their deaths, the family descendants erected a granite monument with the inscription, Eleanor and Edward Blackwood, 1929 to 1937. Their brief lives brought light to what was in the shadows. May their legacy be knowledge and understanding. Dr. Robert Carlson continued his work in the Appalachian Mountains until his retirement in 1965. His study of the Blackwoods and similar families led to the creation of specific educational programs for isolated communities, addressing not only consanguinity issues but also other common health problems in these populations. In 1983, a PBS documentary titled Isolated Lineages, The Genetics of the Mountains presented an anonymous version of the Blackwood story, bringing national attention to health issues in isolated communities. The Emmy-winning program was credited with stimulating significant improvements in rural health services. Redemption through knowledge. The Blackwood story, though deeply tragic, also stands as a powerful example of how scientific knowledge can transform destinies, concludes Dr. Winters. What started as a narrative of isolation and ignorance transformed into a catalyst for change and education. It's a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the potential for growth and learning exists. Today, the Blackwood descendants are scattered across the country, many without full knowledge of their family history. Those who do know carry not only the memory of the tragedy but also the pride in how their family eventually embraced knowledge and worked to transform their legacy. As Dr. Carlson observed in his final notes, human history is full of examples of how ignorance can lead to suffering, but equally abundant are examples of how knowledge can redeem even the darkest chapters of our lives. The Blackwoods exemplify both. If you watched until here, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who truly enjoys the stories on this channel." Don't forget to like the video and share it with people who might be interested in these hidden stories of American society. Your subscription is fundamental for us to continue revealing these cases that history tried to forget. Science and history have much to teach us about the consequences of practices such as consanguinity, and it is our duty to bring these lessons to light.